What we heard there from the member for Taranaki was a piece of fine rhetoric at points. We heard the word delivery on many occasions, but we didn't hear much to back that up. What we've seen is a government that has delivered higher unemployment, that continues to deliver 1,000 New Zealanders every week to Australia, that's delivered dropping median wages, and that's delivered the biggest gap between rich and poor that New Zealand has ever seen. There were also some moments that reminded me of Bill and Ted's Most Excellent Adventure. Some linguistic flourishes that we should cherish. But what sits behind all of that rhetoric is a government that is overseeing an omni-shambles. This government is seeing its support leach away and is seeing desperation creep in as the public of New Zealand realise that beneath the rhetoric is a failure to deliver on promises. The latest promise is to get apprenticeships up and running again. John Key has said that he will supply a sugar hit to those who take up modern apprenticeships. And it is tragic, I would point out, that taxpayer money is now being used, cash, to produce enticements to solve a problem that this government created. This taxpayer money is required to an attempt to solve a problem that this government created. There are 20,000 fewer apprenticeships now than there were when this government took office. And they're proposing to generate an extra 10,000. There are 20,000 fewer than when this government took office. So Labor believes that education is the engine room of the economy. And we have a plan to deliver a stronger engine room and economic growth. This government is playing catch-up. It's halfway aspirational to get back to where Labor was, with the 100,000 extra places that Labor created during its time in office in the tertiary sector. But this government has continued to underfund skill training for New Zealanders. We need every New Zealander properly educated to the best of their abilities so that they can contribute to the greatest of their potential for the betterment of their own lives, for their families and for their communities. And the changes that this government has wrought in the sector have meant that thousands of Kiwis have lost the opportunity to upskill as a result. We've seen restrictions on student loans. We've seen caps on university places. We've seen the slashing of adult and community education funding. We've seen the rolling back of the 20 hours free early childhood education. And we've seen 145 million redirected away from skills training. Young people, in Labor's view, need to be earning or learning. They need opportunities to better themselves. And right now there are 85,000 young people who are not in training, education or employment. That is shameful. These 85,000 New Zealanders are effectively being thrown on the scrap heap by a government that seems not to care. This government seems more interested in preserving the privilege of those that already have than in making an economy where everyone can benefit. In 2010, almost 5,000 prospective students were turned away from universities because enrolment caps had been reached. This pattern continues. If we contrast this record with a Shearer-led government's hands-on approach, we have a plan outlined for a world-class education system at your local school. We have a plan laid out for affordable housing, addressing the market failure that's affecting so many Kiwi families. And we have a plan for jobs. We see apprenticeship opportunities being created with David Shearer's plan for affordable housing and job opportunities. So when we think that contrasts with 20,000 fewer apprenticeships under National, we see a stark contrast. We see two different parties with very different views of the world. So in Dunedin, in my own town, what's been happening? What's been happening with modern apprenticeships? Well, if we look in the Dunedin area, we see that in December 2008, as Labor left office, there were 343 people enrolled in the Otago and Dunedin itself, in modern apprenticeships. By December 2011, that had fallen to 255. a reduction of 26%. A 26% reduction in modern apprenticeships. So the best thing that John Key's announcement might achieve is seeing apprenticeship levels recover to close to what they were when his government took office. It's hardly going to create a step change that we hear in the national rhetoric. And National has finally worked out that youth unemployment and the drop in numbers of apprentices is a problem. We must keep reminding ourselves that this problem is of their making. So, the picture is actually worse than that if we dig beneath the statistics and we see that much of John Key's announcement is actually about a rebranding exercise. He has decided to call just about everybody enrolled in industry training an apprentice. It's a branding exercise. So when Labour's 2008 budget funding ran out, the number of apprenticeships dropped by nearly 20%, the number of industry trainees in the same period has dropped by 37%. John Key is trying to count now some of those industry training people in the modern apprenticeship scheme to boost his figures. They don't deny it. Across the House, they sit with their heads down. They know that the plan that their government has announced, that John Key has announced, is not really a plan. It is a poor effort at trying to paper over the cracks, and a failed attempt at improving the lot of those people who would put themselves out there to better themselves. Labour, by contrast, does have a proper plan, and it starts with an improved focus on careers advice, access to training in schools, youth transition services, and dole payments to employers to take on apprenticeships for 18 and 19-year-olds. We would increase places for young people in education and training. Some of the results as National announces its apprenticeship policy, we see on the one hand they're announcing something that is vaguely in the right direction. At the same time, they're removing money with the other hand, giving with one hand and taking with the other. In the Otago Daily Times this week, there have been 3 stories about postgraduate students affected by the National Party's latest round of cuts. The first one, Lisa Janowski, has been under the impression she'd get her student allowance this year. She's enrolled in a 1-year course, enrolled halfway through the year. She's got to re-enroll because it's the second year of enrolment. She doesn't receive a student allowance. Won't be able to finish her course easily. Her 1-year Commerce Master's degree is under threat. The second story, a student doing a 2-year postgraduate diploma in natural history, filmmaking and communication. A young woman called Veronica Harwood-Stevenson said she would have probably chosen to stay in a job in the film industry in Wellington if she'd known her allowance would be stopped. She's gone from $244 a week on a student allowance to $175 a week on a student loan. She'll be left with an extra $10,000 loan. She would have chosen not to better herself over the longer term because it is very hard to get by without that allowance, and New Zealand would have suffered had the changes already been in place. As a result, though, she personally will suffer by the government's changes. And the third story in the ODT this week, on a similar tune, a fellow called Anthony Davidson, who's been working for 3 years on his MSc, travelling to the Auckland Islands to study nationally endangered southern right whales. 1 year to complete his MSc. He fears he may now not be able to. He's clicked over 24 years of age, is no longer eligible for allowances, a master's degree going begging. These are just some examples of those many people affected by the changes as National seeks to tighten again the criteria for access to loans and allowances, as they again seek to make sure that those who do not have the means cannot study, and that only those who already have wealth are able to access further opportunities. This is a shameful approach from the government. It's a hands-off government that sees unemployment rising, that sees skill levels dropping, and that is failing to invest in the way that will see a prosperous future for our country. We need a visionary government that's willing to take the tough decisions, that's willing to be hands-on, that's willing to implement pro-growth tax reform, universal savings policies, and give the kinds of tools to the Reserve Bank that will help an export-led recovery. Instead, we have a government that's got the worst economic growth record in 50 years, and with its hand on the tiller, guiding us off into a sunset that doesn't really exist.